With Staples Business Advantage, you get the benefit of thousands of experts.
Plus optimizations powered by the latest technological innovations.
1 + 1 =
2.
3.
Whatever. Sign up today and save 20%.
Staples Business Advantage.
Business is
human.
Shares for beginners. Phil Muscatello and Finpods are authorised reps of Money Sherpa. The information in this podcast is general in nature and doesn't take into account your personal situation.
It is staggering.
Absolutely staggering.
And when
we're in the bottom category.
Yeah, but not just at the bottom, in a category on our own. So we are the only member of this bottom category for a developed market. We're the 12th biggest economy in the world.
Yep.
We're the second biggest funds management industry in the world. And we're forcing people to put 10% of their income, or 10.5% of their income into super. And we're the worst at disclosure.
G'day and welcome back to Shares for Beginners. I'm Phil Muscatello. Superannuation represents about a fifth of the net worth of Australian households. There's over $2.2 trillion invested in super, and that's growing at $100 billion every quarter. Choosing the right super fund is one of the most significant financial decisions you'll ever have to make. The choices are mind-boggling. So, joining me to shine the spotlight on the super industry is Vince Scully from Life Sherpa. Hi, Vince.
G'day, Phil. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming back. It's been a couple of years, I think, since you've been here. You were in the garden studio.
Really?
Yeah.
I can't believe it's that long ago.
Maybe even 3 years. Anyway, Vince Scully
It was a hot day, I can remember that.
Yeah, that's right. Vince Scully is a qualified accountant, financial planner and mortgage broker with more than 35 years of experience in banking, finance and financial planning. So Vince, how difficult is it to choose a super fund?
Very, in a word, which is interesting because the government's effectively outsourced retirement planning to the population as a whole and sort of and by inference to the industry, but it hasn't given the consumer the tools to actually choose.
Yep.
So, go back pre-1993, 92, when compulsory super started, many of us made up our own mind. We decided how much of our money to save for retirement. Some of us had employers that had lifetime pension plans.
Like the public service.
Like the public service, of course. Yeah. And then in 1983, we made the whole public their own little fund manager and forced them to save some of their income into this system. And yet we didn't, as a society or as a country, give them the tools to choose it, which is sort of the worst form of deregulation, really. But here we are, 30 years later, and as you said, there's $2.2 trillion. We're now putting 10.5% of our gross income into it. And for many people, certainly those who started in the workforce in the last 20 years, their super will, husbanded properly, provide a very good basis for a comfortable retirement. So that's a good thing. I doubt you would find too many people could argue that that's a bad thing, but there are some serious problems with the system, and giving people a choice without giving them the tools to make the choice strikes me as a dumb idea.
And it's interesting because we're always told that we're kind of the envy of the world in this space, that it's such a unique system that we have here.
Well, it is, and we are either number 2 or number 3 in the size of our funds management industry. Certainly per head, it's a huge number, and the vast bulk of that money is in super. And it at least is providing a bit of a balance to the 90% of household assets that are in real estate. So, not only do we have the biggest funds management industry, or one of the biggest, we also have the second most wealthy households in the world, almost all of which is dependent on the value of real estate, which is the most expensive in the world, or among the most expensive in the world.
So we're basing this interview on your article on the Life Sherpa website, How to Choose the Right Super Fund. And I just want to get back to the basics here. What's the difference between an industry fund and a retail fund? Because they're the main two types of funds.
This is a very unfortunate historical divide. APRA uses categories when it's analysing and reporting funds. And
that's the
APRA,
prudential
the Australian
regulator.
Prudential Regulator.
Yeah, that regulates it.
What's the second A? One of them's Australian. Australian Prudential
Regulatory authority. Yep.
They are the people responsible for regulating public offer super funds. Self-managed super funds are regulated by the tax office, interestingly enough. And they collect a whole bunch of statistics, and they categorise funds as either industry, retail or corporate. But it's largely meaningless from a consumer perspective. And there's also a distinction between the adverts that you see for industry super funds, which are put out by a group called Industry Fund Services, I think it's called, which represents about 23 of the dozens of industry funds. So the ones that have the industry fund label is a small subset of those that are categorised by APRA as industry funds. But it's not a particularly reliable indicator of performance. And we can talk about the impact of member ownership later on, but
because that's part of it.
Which is part of it, but it's not a reliable indicator. So I would suggest to most people they should just ignore it and look at the fund itself. That the label is largely academic, and in some cases it might actually be bad for you to be in a fund that's particularly concentrated in your industry. So if you're a construction worker, being in a fund with thousands of other construction workers who are likely to get laid off at the same time as you are and invest in the industry you're working in strikes me as a lack of diversification and something that might be better avoided. On the other hand, some of these industry-specific funds have insurance offerings that are particularly suited to those industries. So if you work at heights, you work underground, you're a commercial airline pilot, your industry funds, as in the fund that is aimed at your industry, as opposed to which one of the 23 funds, could very well have an insurance offering that is tailored to your needs. But letting the insurance tail wag the investment dog is often a mistake. Sometimes it's a necessary evil, but for the general public, it's probably a bad approach to take. Similarly, why you should never let the tax tail wag the investment dog. We shouldn't let the insurance tail wag the investment dog either. So to answer your initial question, just ignore these labels. Look at the individual product, because there's so much variation on all sides of that equation. And from an investment decision perspective, you can't lump all retail funds together or all corporate funds together or all industry funds together.
Because that's a problem really, though, is it becomes so confusing for regular investors that they just default to whatever their employer gives them as the standard one. What are these default kind of
now that's an interesting
funds
one.
like?
That's an interesting one, and a recent change has complicated that. So let's unpick that for a moment. So when compulsory super started out, your employer had to choose a default fund. And in many cases, that default fund was dictated by your industrial award or your enterprise bargaining agreement. So many people in larger companies were directed by their industrial instrument towards a specific fund. So if you worked in retail, you were often directed towards REST, the Retail Employees Superannuation Trust. You were in healthcare, you were often directed towards HESTA, the Health Employees Superannuation Trust of Australia. And that's sort of where the industry description sort of comes from. Over time, people got more and more choice, but the employer still had to choose a fund. So if you didn't make a choice, you went into your default fund. More recently, the dynamics around default funds have been changed. So an employer now must put the contributions into the fund to which you're stapled, which means that if you don't make a choice, you won't end up with another fund. Which is great if you're running one of the big funds, because most people start their working life in hospitality or retail or doing unskilled industrial work. So if you're in retail, you'll end up in REST. If you're in hospitality, you'll end up in Host Plus. If you're in industry, you'll often end up in Australian Super. And so that's where your money will go. And Australians are notoriously disengaged or lazy or confused, and only 3% of us change funds every year.
Disengaged or lazy or confused,
Yes.
in terms of super, not in general.
Yes.
Let's just clarify for listeners there.
And, this is sort of the curse of too much choice.
Yep.
It's like logging into Netflix. It takes you longer to choose which movie to watch than actually watching it. And that's sort of where default and stapling came in. It's the play something for me, Netflix. Don't make me make a choice. But there are so many pluses to actually making a choice. But how do you make a choice if you don't have the knowledge?
So it seems that a lot of people consider fees as one of the main things to look out for. You're looking for a low fee investment choice. But this is, according to you, not the most important.
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. Fees matter, and they matter a lot. But as a filter, they're not particularly useful.
Yep.
So one of the biggest innovations in disclosure was APRA launching their heat map. So every 6 months, APRA publish a summary of all of the public offer funds and look at fees and returns and a whole bunch of other metrics. And when you look at in fact, all of those ones, we analyse it every time it comes out, there is close to zero correlation between fees and net performance. In fact, when you look at the numbers, there is a very slight correlation between higher fees and higher performance, but it's statistically insignificant, so you can ignore it. And when you look at the top performing funds, so if you look at the top 3 funds or the top 5 funds for the 3-year periods, either just finished or the one before that, the number 1 performing fund was in the top quartile for fees. That is the highest quarter of all funds for fees. So on its own, it's not a meaningful measure. When you're comparing apples with apples, then clearly lower fees wins. But choosing a fund based on fees is little better than throwing a dart at the...
So we can actually discount that at the occasion.
I wouldn't discount it entirely, but it's not the first thing you should look at. They're number 7 in my list of 8 things you should consider. Clearly, don't ignore them. And all other things being equal, lower fees are better. But getting to the all other things are equal bit is actually the hardest part of this. Because lower fees could simply indicate they're invested in lower cost types of assets. So cash is cheaper to manage than emerging market equities, but it's not going to perform as well. Equities are probably cheaper to manage than bonds. Are they the right thing for you? Well, actually, who knows? And property is more expensive to manage than equities. So what's the fee actually telling you? Is it that the fund manager's fee gouging? Or is it that they're invested in more expensive things that might better suit your needs? So getting to a fund that meets your requirements is the first step, and then you can look at fees. And so when you look in the media to ask the very question you just posed, how should I choose a super fund? Almost everything you read, including ASIC's Money Smart, says you should look at past performance and fees. And on the other hand, if you look at any PDS or you read anything else on the ASIC website, it warns you that past performance is no indicator of future performance. And that's clearly true when you look at the APRA report. So if you look at the top 5 funds for the most recent 3 years and the top 5 funds for the 3 years before that, there's only one fund that's in both lists. So it's sort of the easy answer and feels sort of right if you don't look any deeper, because you would say, well, if I'm looking at school exam results, the guy who got an A last year, the guy who's got an A every year is more likely to get an A this year than the guy who's got a D every year. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite work that way when it comes to funds management. And outperforming, whatever that means, is very difficult to do consistently and sustainably, and it's even more difficult to identify in advance. The biggest driver of returns is a thing that we in industry call asset allocation.
Oh, I was going to ask about that because, no, I was just going to say I know listeners get bored because I do go on about asset allocation quite a bit and how important it is and what the mix is and different ages and so forth. So, yes, please.
Yeah. So,
asset allocation.
What is it? That's a really good question. And it's used to mean lots of different things.
And this you can actually see when you log into your super account and you look at your balance.
Yes,
it's going to be divided, divided into the asset classes.
Yeah. So asset allocation is a word that describes what you're invested in. So not which individual bond or individual share you're invested in, but the groups of things you're invested in. And at the highest level, we generally divide the stuff that you can invest in into so-called growth assets and so-called defensive assets. And that's a broad distinction between the types of things that can grow faster than inflation. And inflation is among your biggest enemies looking at retirement because it's so far away. And they're things like, I loosely call them bricks and businesses. So shares, which are businesses, and bricks, which is infrastructure and real estate. And those three categories of things can be loosely grouped as growth assets, things that are capable of returning greater than inflation over time. And that's the engine that drives your ultimate retirement income.
Yep.
The counter to that is so-called defensive assets, which are called defensive because they're designed to even out the lumps and bumps in your growth investment, and that's generally cash and bonds. And they are there to provide ballast. They're the things that stop the ship bobbing around in the water too wildly.
Although it hasn't worked that well over the last year.
Well, certainly the last year
that's
it certainly hasn't.
Story. But anyway, that's another story.
But within each of those categories, how you divide them up is almost as important.
And I'll just interrupt you for a moment because I had a guest who said you can either own it or loan it.
Yeah.
Which I think is a great way of describing the differences between those two. Yeah,
it's a good summary. I use the bricks and businesses or bonds and cash.
Yeah.
But it's you can own the asset or the company.
Yep.
Or the great companies of the world, as J.L. Collins calls them, or you can lend the money.
To governments or
governments
corporations.
or corporations. But even within the growth, not all growth assets are created equal. So if I look at shares, I can look at big companies or small companies or medium companies. Small companies should, in theory, deliver higher returns than big companies. I can look at companies that are in Australia, so domestic equities, or I can look at ones that are listed offshore, so global equities. And I can look at ones that are invested in less developed markets, so-called emerging or frontier markets. And again, they should perform better, although they're riskier. They're riskier because there's less regulation, they're smaller markets, you can't necessarily rely on the same level of disclosure. But they're all factors that go into your asset allocation. And similarly, when it comes to bonds, I can have high investment grade or low investment grades. I can have short-term bonds or long-term bonds. They will all behave differently. And working out those allocations determines your expected return, and it determines the variability in that returns. That you can't have higher returns without accepting lower certainty of outcome. So for long-term investments, so if you're a 20-something, you would want to have, all other things being equal, more stuff invested in growth assets. That comes with it greater variability in the outcome. So when I look at so-called risk, and when you look at a PDS, risk is generally code for volatility. That's something that will impact your way to actually generating the returns. So the underlying assets would be expected to generate a higher return on average. Sometimes they won't, but on balance they will. And the longer you have them, the less variability you get. But for most people, risk isn't actually volatility. It's what's the risk of me achieving my goal? Will I or won't I have a retirement income that will last as long as I do?
Yep.
And give me the standard of living I expect. And there are 3 levers you can pull to get there, which is really time. So the later you retire, the more certain you're going to be of getting it. The amount of money you invest, and obviously there's a trade-off between spending now and putting more away, and the risk you're prepared to take.
And to live through a global financial
crisis. And to live through a global financial crisis and a COVID and a SARS.
Yeah.
If I go back in my investing history...
The Wall Street crash
doesn't count. No, not the Wall
Street
Street crash. The oil crisis is my first memory. They come and go, as my good friend Nick Murray says. The declines are temporary, the advance is inevitable. When you summarise all of that, you say the 2 biggest drivers of your returns is your asset allocation and your behaviour. Because choosing a higher asset allocation than you're prepared to tolerate, where you react adversely. So the number of people who in the GFC went to cash or in the COVID March decline moved their super from high growth to
trying
cash.
Trying to time the market.
And what they've done is lock in downs. So you need to have the right asset allocation to give you the outcome you need based on the amount of money you're prepared to put aside and how late you're prepared to retire, and is consistent with the behaviour that you will exhibit when things go down. And things will go down. Most years you can expect to see a 10% decline. In many years you're going to see a 20% decline. In some years you'll see a 50% decline. So knowing your behaviour
when these inevitably happen
is key to it. So whilst 100% growth allocation would be expected to outperform, most people who choose it don't actually realise the excess return because their behaviour gets in their way.
With Staples Business Advantage, you get the benefit of thousands of experts.
Plus optimizations powered by the latest technological innovations.
1 + 1 =
2.
3.
Whatever. Sign up today and save 20%.
Staples Business Advantage.
Business is
human.
Super is one of the most important investments you'll ever make. But how do you know if you're in the best fund for your situation? Head to lifesherpa.com.au to find out more. Life Sherpa, Australia's most affordable online financial advice.
So in super speak, in super world, when you go in and sign up and you work out what your asset allocation is, the terminology they use is things like balanced or conservative balanced.
Yes.
And this is really a reflection of asset allocation, isn't it?
It is.
And aggressive, is it aggressive
Yep.
the other term they
I must
use?
admit, that's a term I really hate, and very few investors will actually describe themselves as aggressive.
Yes,
So
I know, but this is the key to asset allocation, isn't it, really?
It is.
When you're ticking that box, and even a young person who's in their 20s might go, I'm a conservative person, I don't want to lose money, I'll be in the conservative.
That's right. And our
funds.
natural behaviour as humans, actually, this is my retirement savings. I have to be really careful with them. Therefore, I should invest conservatively.
Yeah,
But
it means something
that's
completely
the absolute
different.
worst thing that you could do. So by taking no risk, investing in no investment risk, and investing in cash, like putting the money in the bank, what you're actually doing is you're guaranteeing that you're going to fail to provide enough for your retirement. So in some ways, that's the riskiest option.
Yep.
The outcome is certain, but it's a certain that you're going to fail to achieve your goals.
Yeah.
So back to your point about choosing a fund, those labels have sort of become meaningless. When I started in this game, balanced meant 60-40 or 50-50. Today,
Between owning it and then loaning
it.
Yeah.
So a traditional balanced fund meant something that was roughly balanced between owning it and loaning it, or growth and defensive. That may or may not make sense today, but balance has become to mean generally somewhere in the 70 growth, 30 defensive to 80 growth. So don't look at the label. look at the asset allocation. The labels are so confusing. I could give you a range of balanced funds that could be anywhere from 60-40 to 90-10. Hugely different beasts, all with the same balanced label. So you need to look below that into the actual asset allocation. Which brings us on to the next problem, is
transparency.
Is what we're transparency. So when someone tells you that this is a 90-10 fund, it might or might not be, for two reasons. One, usually these are targets. So when you look at a fund, and I might just pull up some notes here if that's okay.
Okay. Just while you're pulling up the notes, I just wanted to say that, and this is a quote from the article, Morningstar reports that Australia ranks at the bottom of 26 global markets for investment portfolio disclosure, which I think is just astonishing.
It is staggering.
Absolutely staggering.
And when
we're in the bottom category.
Yeah, but not just at the bottom, in a category on our own. So we are the only member of this bottom category for a developed market. We're the 12th biggest economy in the world. We're the second biggest funds management industry in the world. And we're forcing people to put 10% of their income, or 10.5% of their income into super. And we're the worst at disclosure. But now, thank you for that. I've now pulled it up. So, for example, Australian Super Balanced, which is the default option. So if your employer has chosen Australian Super as your default fund, this is the one you'll be in. And I'm not picking on Australian Super, it's just an example. Their target asset allocation is 78 growth, 22 defensive.
That's their balanced option.
That's a balanced option. The actual result at the 30th of June 2022 was 73-27, but they have significantly wide discretion in what they can actually do against that target. And if they were at the lowest or the lower end of the available range they have, that could be 30 growth, 70 defensive, i.e. a hyper-conservative portfolio, or at the highest growth, it could be 100% zero. Now, they are the ranges, and as you can see, the actual's not that far from the target, but it's clearly a more defensive spread, which might indicate that they took decided to take some risk off the table during COVID. But you could end up with a highly conservative portfolio.
I think it's really good for listeners to understand these percentages, though.
I
think this is a great takeaway to know what 80%, 20% and so forth means in terms of just breaking down these into individual areas of investment and what they actually mean.
Sam Cecilia, the CIO of Houseplus, was in the press during the year saying, we have 0% in bonds. And he's running a fund that is got a target allocation of 76 growth, 24% defensive. You're not necessarily guaranteed to get what you think you're buying, and they don't disclose how they're going to decide where in that range they're going to go. There is a place for what's called dynamic asset allocation. I'm not a fan because it smacks of market timing, but there is a place for it.
Presumably there's going to be funds within that who will be doing the market timing on your behalf anyway.
Sure. But what I want to know is, what am I actually buying? And the short answer is, I don't know. So if a member of Life Sherpa comes to me and says, I'm invested in the Australian Super Balance Fund, actually working out what they're really invested in is a really hard job. And it's partly why advice costs so much. If you've worked out that I want to be in a 78-22, which rounding, call it 80-20, if you buy Australian Super because their target's close to that, you've actually ended up with something that's closer to 70-30, and you could have ended up with something that was 100-0. So, and you won't know till the end of the year. So that's a disclosure problem. So not only do you not know that what you're actually going to get in most cases, but the way people assign assets or investment things they're invested in between growth and defensive does vary a little bit. The rules around this are a bit woolly. So some people would treat infrastructure, for example, which is more stable than investing in banks or industrial companies, because their revenues are a bit more stable.
Roads, airports.
So roads, airports, power stations,
Yeah.
pipelines, they tend to exhibit lower volatility, or a lower beta, as the mathematicians call it. They move around less than the market does.
Yeah.
And so they have some defensive characteristics. We would classify them still as growth assets because they are in the bricks category. Well, they're sort of on the border between bricks and businesses. They have some characteristics that real estate exhibits because they have generally CPI-related income or GDP-related income, but they have growth potential. So some of that, depending on which fund you look at, some of that would be allocated to the defensive category and some might be in the growth category. And APRA, the regulator, sets the rules and says, well, if it's listed, you must count it as 100% growth. Whereas if it's unlisted, you can allocate half of it to defensive. So
that's interesting, So like if it's, a toll road, that's a listed toll road company, for example, or...
Correct. So,
or even as an example, Sydney Airports, which was listed and then is now unlisted.
Exactly. So Sydney Airport's a really good case in point because pre that takeover, which I'll talk about in a moment, before that, UniSuper owned, I think, 19% of Sydney Airport. And when it was listed, that would have been in the growth category. Host Plus owned Brisbane Airport through its investment in the IFM Infrastructure Fund. That was unlisted, so half of that would have been allocated to defensive. So when I look at the two investments, I go, I can have a listed liquid investment in the country's biggest airport with low capex requirements and relatively low growth built in. Or I can have a higher risk investment in a secondary airport with massive capex and high growth built into the price.
Gee, no wonder people's eyes glaze over when they look at their super and go, it's too hard.
It is. And that's why you need advice. So the day that this group of super funds bought all of the shares in Sydney Airport and delisted it. So on that day, UniSuper's investment in Sydney Airport, in the signature of a pen, became
with no difference in operational capabilities.
That's right. And in the middle of COVID, suddenly became half a defensive asset. Now, there are academic reasons to justify why that's the case. They're the rules. I'm not suggesting anyone's doing anything nefarious or illegal. They're just following the rules.
Yep.
But the rules, whilst they have some academic basis, don't really help the consumer. And part of the argument as to why you might treat it as defensive is because it's unlisted, it's less volatile. That is, Sydney Airport, the price changed every day as millions of shares changed hands and it reflected all the information. The value on Brisbane Airport was determined by a group of analysts in a back room with a spreadsheet and was only corrected to market when an actual trade happened.
And that's a big difference with unlisted, isn't it?
It is.
And it's a real problem with unlisted because you really don't know what you're getting. And
that's right.
There's a lack of liquidity because you don't know what it's going to be worth until it's actually...
That's right.
Someone is paying for it.
And the upside, though, so I don't want to be negative on unlisted assets because all other things being equal, an unlisted asset should give you a higher return than the same asset listed, as long as you buy it at the right price. And that's because investors are prepared to accept a lower return on a listed asset in return for liquidity and transparency. So they're saying, I'm prepared to accept a lower return on this asset because I can see the price every day and I can get in and out whenever I want. But they want a risk premium for buying unlisted assets. They should give you a higher return in return for accepting lower volatility. But the problem here is not the transaction itself, it's the instant reclassification of it and the fact that we have no information to ascertain whether the price we're buying it at, or indeed selling it at, if you are starting to retire or moving funds, is what it's actually going to be worth. And we've sort of seen the impact of this in the real estate market. So if you look at the movements in listed real estate funds or REITs,
which is mainly industrial and commercial
or
properties
Westfield,
rather than residential.
It's
not residential.
No, generally not. That's moved down much further, reflecting the fact that half the offices are empty and no one's going to retail anymore because they're all shopping online. But the unlisted asset prices haven't moved down anywhere near as much. And so that would beg the question is, if I'm investing in funds with lots of unlisted assets, am I paying too much for this? And investing often comes down to the price you pay initially. I mean, what does Warren Buffett say about margin of error and buying it at the right price? So
buying at the right price gives you the margin of error. Something to that effect.
That's why I'm not as good an investor as Warren. But that's the challenge for a consumer, saying getting the higher returns that are available from unlisted assets could be a good thing, but how do I know I'm buying them at the right price? And how do I know that these analysts in the back room are doing the right thing? I've supervised this task in over 20 years ago. I know where the skeletons are buried, and we used to have I'm not going to name my former employer, but we used to have a saying that if you torture the numbers for long enough, they will eventually confess. So
now we've confused everyone.
We have.
Completely confused everyone. Where can people get advice from?
I'm not saying... I mean, obviously, you might say, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Because he runs an advice business.
Yeah.
But, given enough time, commitment, and engagement, a consumer could do enough work to review the 100 and odd options and reflect on their own needs and come to a conclusion. People could do that. And that's why I set out the 8-step methodology in that article that you referred to. So if you...
Which we'll link to there.
So if you spend enough time, read enough PDSs and educate yourself enough, you could do that. Because life gets in the way. We're busy people. We have kids. We take them to school. We want to enjoy ourselves. We want to...
Life's too short for PDSs. Life's
very short. And PDSs are... They've all become very similar. Like the fee section is always section 6. The investment section is usually section 5. So they have a structure to them that makes them relatively easy to follow. But the sameness obscures the differences. And so you need to look for what's not said and what are the subtle differences between them, because it's those subtleties that give you the insight. And are you prepared to keep doing that? And the fact that only 3% of people change super funds every year, mostly because they move jobs, is a sign that it's actually a very hard job. And that's why I created Life Sherpa, to be able to deliver advice at a price that is affordable for the average Australian. So for $499, we will review your existing super fund and make a recommendation. And for many of our members, they will have their annual fees and get improved transparency and an asset allocation that matches their risk profile. And, $499 in the scheme of what will provide for potentially 40 years of your life strikes me as being a very modest sum, even if you only have 20, 30, 40, 50, $100,000 in your fund. Because if you're a 30-year-old, this is probably your biggest asset if you haven't bought a home. And remember, the one thing that I keep coming back to is that 2/3 of the money you spend in retirement will come from the return on your money. So this is one of those decisions that you can make relatively quickly, has a very minor impact on your day-to-day budget, but will have a massive impact on future fill.
Fantastic. So we're going to put a link in the show notes and the blog post to the article about super if people want to go through and find out exactly what's going on. But Life Sherpa, how can people find out more?
We're at lifesherpa.com.au on the web.
Facebook as well, I think.
We're on Facebook I think it's at My Life Sherpa on Facebook, but we're certainly there. We're on Instagram, and I occasionally tweet, and Phil's teaching me how to
be a Twitter user,
to be a better tweeter. So,
well, Twitter's not very good for hollow self-promotion. It's more for shit posting and having fun.
Oh, we don't do hollow self-promotion, as you know. But lifesherpa.com.au, you can start with a free 30-day trial and get to talk to one of our team.
Vince Scully, thanks very much for joining me today.
Phil Muscatello, thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Shares for Beginners. You can find more at sharesforbeginners.com. If you enjoy listening, please take a moment to rate or review in your podcast player, or tell a friend who might want to learn more about investing for their future.
At Staples Business Advantage, our experts can help you find furniture that fits any design and budget, while AI can
Recommend products based on preferences, generate 3D models for visualization, and optimize space planning for office furniture.
take advantage of our team's eye for style and design.
And my eye for, wait, I have no eyes, only algorithms.
Let Staples Business Advantage use today's latest innovations plus our team's experience to make furnishing an office space easier for you.
Sign up today and save 20%.
Staples Business Advantage.
Business is
Human.